spectacularly, and it took a while to figure out why. But it's important to understand when you're doing heuristics and you're saying, these are features we extract and these are patterns, train them in a domain because they may be very, very different in another domain. So in looking at email, another thing we did was expertise brokering. There's a fantastic paper from '99 from Kruger and Dunning called Unskilled and Unaware of It. It's one of my favorite papers of all time. So they went out and they asked a whole group of people, how good do you think you are at grammar, logic, and humor? And they had everyone score themselves. Did they think they were in the first quatrile, the second quatrile, the third quatrile, the fourth quatrile? They then gave everyone an exam on each of these three areas. And they plotted the results of the exam against how people rated themselves. And interestingly, the bottom quatrile was more or less, they thought they were in the 70s. The second quatrile thought they were worse than the first quatrile. The third quatrile, these guys thought they were awful. Many of them thought they were about average. And the top quatrile, they at least picked up a little bit. Now, within the error of this, you can see that the worst possible way to find out if someone is good at something is to ask them if they're good at something. You might as well just throw a dart. You're going to get an answer between 50 and 70%, irrespective of whether they're good at it or not. So we said, okay, this isn't terribly helpful. So we had a job of assigning consultants to projects. And the self-assessed skills were not working. So we started looking at things like, what do they talk about on PowerPoints? When people send a question to them, who do they ask when they want to know who's good at Linux? Who do they send the question to? Who's worked with this company before? So we found there were a lot of things you could look at in terms of products that people made as part of their everyday work that you could find a lot more about what they were good at than just asking them. So that was another communication analysis. It was Professor Warren Sack out of University of Santa Cruz, who did a fun one tracking, for example, people who complain about things in Linux and people who actually check in fixed code, and was able to show there's a very small overlap between people who assert what should be done to fix things and people who actually go and fix them. And now Sun Microsystems picked up that code to help managers understand what was going on inside their development groups. So one thing that comes out when people hear about this is there's a problem if people sign up on a social networking site or on any site under a couple of aliases, right? They can go and do things like, this was the Scott Peterson trial. Does anyone remember this from a few years ago? Mm-hmm. So it was big, Court TV had a lot on it. And we started tracking the discussion site, and we found some weird things. So Marigold here says, I think Scott did it. He's abhorrent and a sleazeball. Someone said, Marigold, just because he's sleazy doesn't mean he's a murderer. Let's just stick to the facts. And suddenly Mr. Crabapple would jump in and say, well, I agree with Marigold. This is an important crime, and he has the personality to carry it out. Thanks, Mr. Crabapple, and let's hope he gets caught. So if you look at the corpus, you begin to notice some interesting things. The first is there are these weird sentence constructs like the word abhorrent or the ... and that are, interestingly, both Marigold and Mr. Crabapple are using. And in fact, if you look at enough examples, you realize that they're actually the same person under two pseudonyms. So we said, okay, how hard is it to figure out if two people are the same person? It's probably quite difficult. So we took a large email corpus and we double-blinded it, and we trained things on it, trained classifiers on just 3-word sentence groupings, and found that you can, with 95% accuracy, assign an email to the right person. The language that we use is highly individual, and it's very difficult to break the habits that you develop, how you speak, what phrases you use, whatever. So with 100 training examples of email and 100 test examples, I can stick two people together with very high accuracy.
In this kind of study, do you primarily rely on the training, or did you have grammar, linguistic rules, or did you bring in intention, sentiment, or other kind of thing? Did you need some word dictionaries?
So when this work was started, and this was done primarily by Andrew Tompkins and Jasmine Novak, we should give them credit for this. So they said, this must be a really hard problem, let's dig into it. So they started with the simplest feature they could think of, which was 3-word groupings. And then they realized that worked really, 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 really well. So there were things like, there are very few people who enumerate things like one space, whatever. And when they do, they might say open paren, one closed paren. There's only one person who did that on the entire list, yet they had 3 aliases where they did that under. Now we don't know for sure they were the same person, but the language use was the same, the misspellings were the same, there were a lot of things that led one to believe they were really the same person. Yes?
What if we change the domain of the discussion to, let's say, a scientific domain or a professional domain where the language is pretty much set, and the incorporation of individual biases
Would
is
be a
very less?
great experiment. I would go and grab a bunch of papers and see, it'd be a fun experiment to do. See if you can take a paragraph out of a random paper and figure out who the author is. I mean, this has been beaten to death for Shakespeare, right? I mean, that's the classic example. But it'd be interesting to see if that applies there as well. We did it in the social domain. But.
Dan, out of curiosity, were there any gender differences in this data?
I don't recall that we were able to pick any up. Because we had people who were representing themselves as multiple genders. Okay, so sometimes it's less about doing deep analytics, and sometimes it's just show me the pattern, right? It doesn't have to be amazingly tough analytics, but as Amit said many times, if you can't show someone something, it doesn't do you any good at all. And just showing people can be quite powerful. So the first project we did on this was IBM has a large intranet. It's grown organically over the past 30 years. And a few years ago, they told the CIO's office, we would like you to manage this, right? I mean, imagine being a poor fool. You have 5 people. Here are 45,000 web servers in the intranet. Go make sense of them. And where it becomes a problem is, you know, I post the DB2 version 6 manual, and you post the DB2 version 9 manual, and Amit does a search on a query, or on a command, which copy is he going to get? Because if he gets this copy, it's outdated, right? And it's probably also the one he's going to get because it's been there longer. So overlapping, redundant, repeated information makes the internal search problem really hard. So we just put together a bunch of tools that looked at the semantic linking between sites, gave a tool that showed how linked they were, what kinds of content they were, how much of it was replicated, and things like who owns a site took them 6 hours of work over 1 to 5 calendar days. We got it down to 2 to 5 minutes, right? How often is the site changing? Is it an active site? Is it not an active site? You know, went from a week to 5 to 10 minutes. Language content, directory layout, content duplication, site summarization, what's being talked about. You can see these aren't very hard things to do, but they're incredibly powerful tools if you've been told, find out what the site is about, why is it still running, can we shut it down? So again, just a very large content domain inside the enterprise rather than outside. Popularity tracking is a very different space than that. There's specialized lingo, and I have to take a short moment and apologize to Mina publicly. When Mina started working with us on the BBC project, she had perfect Queen's English. It was really quite spectacular. After 2 years on the project, about half her emails I cannot make any sense of whatsoever. They've got these 3-word abbreviations or whatnot. And I have to go look at
Peter's.
Exactly. She's been reading all of these MySpace sites, and it's just corrupted her email terribly. There's an ambiguous entity extraction. The context is extremely important. And they often have what we gently call an indifferent approach to grammar and spelling that complicates things further. So we did this project called the Sound Index. So the BBC, I hadn't known this when I started it, but the BBC was actually started in the 40s with the mission of bringing popular music to the British people. So they take this very, very seriously. They started with radio. Now they had a concern, and I know this is going to shock everyone, but they thought the RIAA may not be an entirely honest organization. Shocking? I know that's the record industry of America. So, does anyone know what payola is?
Yeah.
What is it?
Record companies used to, maybe still do, pay disc jockeys to play their records.
Exactly right. The last year that 4 of the 5 major record labels got fined over $1 million for this was?
Don't know.
2009. Yeah, they come out in November.
Mhm.
So there's this